In the depths of medieval winter, when the world grew silent beneath blankets of snow, one man's journey through the deadliest blizzard of his century would become a legend whispered by firesides for generations to come. Hello, friends, and welcome to this evening's story. Tonight, I invite you to travel back through the mists of time, to a world of stone monasteries and dirt roads, of candlelit prayers and fierce winters that could swallow entire villages whole. We're journeying to the year 1142, to the rolling hills and dense forests of what we now call Central Europe, where our story finds a solitary monk named Brother Anselm making his way through a landscape about to be transformed by nature's most fearsome power. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift back to that distant winter where the air smells of wood smoke and frozen earth, and where the sky holds secrets that only the wind can tell. Brother Anselm had been a monk for 17 years, ever since he was a boy of 12, brought to the monastery of St. Gallen by his father after a fever had taken his mother and 2 sisters. The monastery, with its thick stone walls and arched corridors that echoed with Gregorian chants, had become his entire world. He knew every flagstone in the chapel floor, every crack in the plaster of his small cell, every tree in the apple orchard that provided fruit for the brothers' simple meals. His days followed the same rhythm they had for nearly 2 decades, marked by the ringing of bells that called him to prayer 7 times from dawn until the darkness of night. Matins in the deep hours before sunrise, lauds as the first light touched the eastern windows, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before sleep claimed him. Between these devotions, he worked in the scriptorium, his thin fingers stained with ink as he copied manuscripts with painstaking care, preserving ancient texts that might otherwise be lost to time. But on this particular December morning, as frost painted intricate patterns on the narrow windows of his cell, Brother Anselm was preparing for something different, something that filled him with both purpose and a flutter of anxiety in his chest. The abbot had called him 3 days prior to his private chambers, a room that smelled of beeswax and old leather, where a fire crackled in a stone hearth. The abbot, Father Dominic, was an elderly man with a long white beard and eyes that seemed to hold both great kindness and great sorrow. He had explained that their sister monastery, St. Theodule, lay in the mountains to the south, a journey of 2 days by foot through the valleys and over the high passes. The monks there were in desperate need of several items: a particular medicinal manuscript that detailed treatments for winter ailments, blessed oils for their sacraments, and most importantly, a reliquary containing a fragment of bone said to be from Saint Columban himself, which was needed for the consecration of their new chapel. Brother Anselm had been chosen for this mission because of his youth, his strong constitution despite his lean frame, and his reputation for careful attention to detail. The precious items would be entrusted to him, packed carefully in a leather satchel that he would carry across his shoulders. Father Dominic had placed both hands on Anselm's head in blessing, and had spoken words that now echoed in the young monk's mind as he prepared for departure. "Go with God, my son, and may he guide your steps and shield you from harm." Winter in the mountains can be treacherous, but I have faith that you will succeed where others might falter." The morning of his departure arrived with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Brother Anselm rose in darkness for matins, his breath visible in the cold air of his cell. After prayers, he broke his fast with dark bread and weak ale, then went to collect his provisions. The monastery's cellarer, Brother Otto, a stout man with perpetually rosy cheeks, had prepared a bundle of food: dried meat, hard cheese wrapped in cloth, oat cakes, dried apples, and a small flask of wine for warmth. Brother Anselm wore his warmest woolen robe, layered beneath his black habit, and thick leather boots that had been waterproofed with rendered fat. Over all of this, he draped a heavy cloak of undyed wool that reached nearly to his ankles, fastened at his throat with a simple wooden clasp. The precious satchel was given to him in the sacristy by Father Dominic himself. The old abbot's hands trembled slightly. Whether from age or cold or emotion, Anselm could not tell. Inside the leather bag, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was the manuscript, its pages of vellum covered in careful Latin script detailing herbal remedies and treatments. The blessed oils were sealed in small clay vessels, packed with wool to prevent breaking. And the reliquary, a small silver box no larger than Anselm's palm, decorated with simple crosses and containing its holy treasure, was wrapped in the finest linen the monastery possessed. Father Dominic had made Anselm promise 3 times to guard these items with his life, to keep them dry and safe, and to deliver them personally into the hands of Abbot Gregor at St. Theodule. As the sun began to rise, painting the frost-covered world in shades of pale gold and soft pink, Brother Anselm stood at the monastery gate. Several of his brother monks had gathered to see him off, their faces solemn in the early light. Brother Friedrich, who worked beside him in the scriptorium, embraced him and whispered a prayer for safe travels. Brother Otto pressed an extra package of oat cakes into his hands, insisting he might need them. And Father Dominic made the sign of the cross over him one final time, his voice firm as he intoned the ancient words of blessing. Then the heavy wooden gate creaked open, and Brother Anselm stepped out onto the road that led southward into the unknown. The first day of travel was peaceful in a way that seemed almost magical. The road, such as it was, wound through a valley where a river ran, its surface beginning to freeze along the edges in lacy patterns of ice. Bare trees stood like silent sentinels on either side, their branches etched black against a sky that was pale and cloudless. Anselm's footsteps crunched on the frozen earth, and his breath plumed white in the cold air. He walked steadily, pausing only to pray at the appointed hours, kneeling by the roadside with his rosary beads clicking softly through his fingers. The landscape was beautiful in its winter starkness, stripped of all pretense, showing only the essential bones of the earth. Hills rolled away in gentle waves, covered in brown grass and patches of snow. Here and there, a distant farmhouse sent up a thin column of smoke, a sign of human life in the vast quietness. By midday, Anselm had made good progress. He stopped to rest by a stone bridge that crossed the river, and ate some of the bread and cheese Brother Otto had packed. The cold was sharp but not unbearable, and he felt strong, his legs accustomed to the long walks he often took in the monastery grounds during his times of contemplation. As he sat there, watching the water slide past beneath its growing coat of ice, he thought about the journey ahead. According to Father Dominic's instructions, he should reach a small village called Eisenberg by nightfall, where the monks were known to the local priest. Father Dominic had sent word ahead, and Anselm would be given shelter for the night. Then, on the second day, he would need to climb into the mountains, following a path that rose through pine forests and over a high pass before descending into the valley where Sankt Theodule stood. He continued on as the sun began its descent, and true to the abbot's word, as twilight gathered, he saw the village of Eisenberg ahead. It was a small place, perhaps 30 houses clustered together, with a modest church whose spire reached toward the darkening sky. Smoke rose from many chimneys, and the smell of cooking fires drifted on the cold air. Anselm's stomach rumbled, reminding him that his simple meal by the bridge had been many hours ago. He found the church easily, a stone building at the village center, and knocked on the door of the house beside it, the priest's dwelling. Father Wilhelm, the village priest, was a man in his middle years, with a round face and a warm smile that immediately put Anselm at ease. He welcomed the traveling monk as if he were an old friend, ushering him into a small but comfortable room where a fire burned in the hearth. Father Wilhelm's housekeeper, an elderly woman named Hilda, brought them a supper of thick pottage, black bread, and roasted turnips. As they ate, Father Wilhelm asked about the monastery and about Father Dominic, whom he had met years before. They spoke of the church, of the spiritual state of the village, and of the coming of winter. And it was then, as the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the walls, that Father Wilhelm's expression grew serious. "Brother Anselm," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "I must tell you something that concerns me greatly. You plan to cross the mountain pass tomorrow, yes?" When Anselm nodded, the priest continued, "The weather has been strange these past few days. There is a feeling in the air, a pressure, a waiting quality that the old folk recognize. My housekeeper, Hilda, comes from mountain people, and she has been watching the sky with worried eyes. She says that a great storm is coming, perhaps the worst we have seen in many years. I would urge you to wait, to stay here until this storm passes." Anselm felt his heart sink at these words. He understood the wisdom of the priest's caution, but he also felt the weight of his mission pressing upon him. The monks at Sankt Theodule were expecting him, were waiting for the manuscript and the blessed oils and the precious reliquary. And yet, he was not a foolish man. He had lived through many winters, had heard tales of travelers lost in mountain storms, frozen to death mere feet from safety. He spent a long moment in silent prayer, asking for guidance, for clarity in this decision. "Father Wilhelm," he finally said, "I am deeply grateful for your concern and your wisdom. Tell me truly, how long might such a storm last if it comes?" The priest exchanged a glance with old Hilda, who had been listening from the doorway. She stepped forward, her weathered face gravely. In the mountains, young brother, such a storm could last 3 days, perhaps 4, perhaps even longer. And when it comes, it will come suddenly like. One moment the sky is clear, and the next, the world disappears in white. You cannot see your hand before your face, and the cold cuts through to your very bones. I have seen strong men, hunters who know these mountains like their own hearths, lost and frozen in such storms. She paused, her old eyes searching his face. But I have also seen something in you tonight, brother. There is a light about you, a purpose. If you must go, then go with my blessing and these words of advice. Watch the sky constantly, and if the wind changes, if the clouds come swiftly from the north, seek shelter immediately. Do not try to outrun such a storm. Better to be late in your arrival than to never arrive at all. Anselm thanked them both for their wisdom and their kindness. That night, lying on a straw pallet in a small room off the church, he wrestled with his decision. Through the narrow window, he could see stars scattered across the black sky, cold and distant. The night was quiet save for the occasional bark of a dog or the settling of the house around him. He prayed for much of the night, his lips moving silently in the darkness, asking for courage, for wisdom, for protection. And somewhere in those dark hours, a clarity came to him. He would set out in the morning as planned, but he would heed Hilda's warning. He would watch the sky, and he would be ready to seek shelter at the first sign of danger. When dawn broke, it became gray and cold. Anselm rose for his morning prayers, his joints stiff from the hard bed and the chill that permeated everything. Father Wilhelm offered him a good breakfast of porridge sweetened with honey, and Hilda packed him extra provisions, including a small bundle of kindling wood wrapped in oiled cloth. "If you need to make a fire in the mountains," she said, pressing it into his hands, "dry wood will be precious beyond measure." She also gave him a strange gift, a small ball of string. "If the snow becomes too deep and you fear you are wandering in circles," she explained, "you can tie this to a tree and follow it back if you need to retrace your steps. It is an old mountain trick." Father Wilhelm walked with him to the edge of the village, where the road began to climb toward the mountains that loomed in the distance, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. The priest blessed him once more, making the sign of the cross with great deliberation, and spoke words that Anselm would remember in the hours to come. "May the Lord be your shepherd in the wilderness, your fortress in the storm, and your light in the darkness. Go with God, brother." Anselm set his face toward the mountains and began to climb. The road here was narrower, less traveled, winding upward through bare fields and past abandoned summer pastures. The air grew colder with each step, and the wind began to pick up, coming in gusts that tugged at his cloak and made his eyes water. He kept a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, his breath coming harder now as the slope increased. By mid-morning, he had entered the forest, a dense stand of pine trees that rose straight and tall on either side of the path. Here the wind was less fierce, blocked by the trees, but the silence was profound and somehow oppressive. His footsteps seemed too loud, and once, startled by the sudden flight of a bird, he he found his heart racing. The path continued to climb, switchbacking up the mountainside. Occasionally, through breaks in the trees, Anselm could glimpse the valley below, growing smaller and more distant with each hour. He paused at one such viewpoint to rest and drink from his water skin, and it was then that he first noticed the change in the sky. The gray had deepened, taken on a yellowish tinge that seemed unnatural and threatening. The wind, which had been gusty, had shifted, and now came from the north with a new intensity, a cutting edge that found every gap in his clothing. And the temperature, already cold, seemed to be dropping moment by moment. Anselm thought of Hilda's warning and felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. He looked at the sky more carefully, shading his eyes with his hand. The clouds were moving now, rolling and churning, and they seemed to be coming closer, descending from the mountain peaks like a living thing. He judged the distance he had yet to travel. According to Father Dominic's description, the pass itself was still perhaps 2 hours ahead, and beyond that, the descent to St. Theodule would take several more hours. If he hurried, if he pushed himself, could he make it over the pass before the storm broke? Even as he considered this, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were small at first, delicate crystals that drifted down almost lazily, landing on his cloak and in his hair. But within minutes, the snow was falling more heavily, and the flakes had grown larger, coming down thick and fast. The wind picked up further, driving the snow nearly horizontal at times, and visibility began to decrease. Anselm realized with a sinking feeling that the storm Hilda had predicted was upon him, and he was still far from the pass, far from any shelter he knew of. He had a choice to make, and he had to make it quickly. He could try to go forward, to reach the pass and descend the other side, hopping to outrun the worst of the storm. Or he could turn back, retreat to Eisenberg and the safety of Father Wilhelm's house, though that meant delaying his mission by days and possibly failing in his duty to deliver the precious items to St. Theodule. As he stood there in the swirling snow, one hand clutching his cloak closed at his throat, the other gripping the strap of his satchel, Anselm prayed with an intensity he had never felt before. He prayed for guidance, for clarity, for a sign of what he should do. And in that moment, through the snow and the wind, he heard something. It was a sound that seemed to come from ahead, from deeper in the forest. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he listened more carefully, it seemed almost like a human voice, faint and distant, calling out. Without quite knowing why, Anselm began to move toward the sound, leaving the path and pushing through the undergrowth beneath the pines. The snow was already beginning to accumulate on the ground, covering the rocks and roots that lay hidden beneath. He moved carefully, calling out himself now, "Hello. Is someone there? Do you need help?" The voice came again, clearer now and definitely human. It was calling for help, the words thin and desperate in the wind. Anselm pushed through a dense thicket of low-hanging branches, snow shaking down on his head and shoulders, and emerged into a small clearing. There, huddled at the base of a large pine tree, was a figure. As Anselm hurried closer, he saw it was a man, perhaps in his 30s, dressed in the rough wool and leather of a woodcutter or hunter. The man's face was pale, twisted in pain, and one of his legs was extended before him at an unnatural angle. "Thank God," the man gasped as Anselm knelt beside him. "Thank God someone came. I fell, brother, fell from those rocks yonder." He gestured vaguely toward an outcropping barely visible through the snow. "My leg is broken, I think, and I cannot walk. I have been here since yesterday, and I thought I would freeze to death before anyone found me." He was shivering violently, his lips beginning to turn blue, and Anselm could see that he was in grave danger. The monk's training, his years of discipline and service took over. He shrugged off his heavy cloak and wrapped it around the injured man, though the loss of its warmth hit him immediately like a physical blow. He opened his satchel, moving the precious items carefully aside, and pulled out his bundle of provisions. He forced the man to eat some of the oat cakes and drink a little of the wine, all the while speaking in a calm, soothing voice, telling him that he would be all right, that help was here now, that God had not abandoned him. "What is your name, brother?" Anselm asked as he worked, trying to keep the man alert and focused. "Matthias," the man said through chattering teeth. "I am Matthias, a woodcutter from Eisenberg. I came up yesterday to check my traps before the winter sets in fully, and I was a fool to not watch my footing better." Anselm looked around the clearing, his mind racing. The storm was intensifying by the minute. The snow was now falling so thickly that he could barely see to the edge of the clearing, and the wind howled through the pines with a voice like demons. He knew several things with absolute certainty. Matthias could not walk and could not be left alone, for he would surely die. The temperature was dropping catastrophically, and both of them would freeze if they remained exposed. And turning back to Eisenberg was no longer an option, for Anselm was not sure he could even find the path now, much less follow it through the blizzard while supporting an injured man. He needed to find shelter, and he needed to find it immediately. Anselm stood and scanned the area, shielding his eyes from the driving snow. The outcropping of rocks that Matthias had pointed to caught his attention. If there were rocks, there might be an overhang, a cave, some place where they could escape the wind and snow. He told Matthias to wait, that he would return in a moment, and struggled through the deepening snow toward the rocks. Fortune, or perhaps Providence, was with him. Behind the outcropping, half hidden by a fallen tree and thick undergrowth, was a shallow cave. It was not large, perhaps 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling low enough that Anselm would have to duck to enter, but it was dry and protected from the wind. Without wasting a moment, he returned to Matthias, and with considerable effort and no small amount of pain for the injured man, managed to half carry, half drag him to the cave. He settled Matthias against the back wall, where the rock was driest, and covered him again with the cloak. Now came the critical task, fire. Without fire, they would not survive the night. Anselm thanked God for old Hilda and her foresight in giving him the bundle of dry kindling. He gathered what additional wood he could find near the cave, broken branches and dead wood that was not yet too wet from the snow, and piled it inside. Using his flint and steel, which he carried in a small pouch at his belt, he worked to create a spark. His fingers were already numb with cold, and the task that should have taken minutes seemed to take forever. Strike the steel, catch the spark in the charred cloth, blow gently to nurture it into flame, add the smallest pieces of kindling, blow again, add more carefully. And then, miraculously, beautifully, a flame caught and grew. Anselm fed it with painstaking care, adding larger and larger pieces of wood until a small but genuine fire was crackling in the entrance to the cave. The smoke rose and found its way out through gaps in the rock above, and the blessed warmth began to spread through their shelter. Matthias, who had been silent and alarmingly still, opened his eyes and managed a weak smile. "You are an angel, brother," he whispered. "An angel sent by God himself." Anselm settled beside him, and together they huddled close to the fire as outside the blizzard raged with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. The wind screamed through the forest, a sound like nothing Anselm had ever heard, full of rage and power. Snow came down in sheets, in walls, in blinding curtains of white that obliterated the world. Trees cracked and groaned under the weight of ice and snow, and occasionally there was a tremendous crash as a branch, or sometimes an entire tree, fell under the burden. The temperature plummeted until the air itself seemed to burn the lungs with each breath. But inside the cave, Anselm and Matthias were alive. The fire, fed constantly with the wood, Anselm had gathered and protected from the wind by the cave's entrance, kept them warm enough to survive. Anselm shared his food with Matthias, giving him the larger portions, knowing that the injured man needed strength to fight off shock and cold. He melted snow in his small cooking pot over the fire to provide water. And as the hours passed, as day faded into a night that was indistinguishable from day in the whiteness and fury of the storm, Anselm tended to his companion with a patience and gentleness that came from his years of monastic service. Matthias's leg was indeed broken, the bone fractured somewhere between knee and ankle. Anselm had no medical training beyond the basic care all monks learned, but he did his best. Using strips torn from the bottom of his inner robe, he fashioned a crude splint from 2 straight branches he found in the cave, binding the leg as securely and gently as he could. Matthias bore the pain with gritted teeth and only occasional groans, and when it was done, he gripped Anselm's hand with desperate gratitude. As the night wore on, the 2 men talked. Matthias told Anselm about his life in Eisenberg, about his wife and 3 children waiting for him at home, probably frantic with worry by now. He spoke of his trade, the hard work of cutting timber, the satisfaction of providing for his family. And Anselm, in turn, spoke of the monastery, of the quiet rhythm of prayer and work, of the beauty he found in the ancient manuscripts he copied, preserving knowledge for future generations. He told Matthias about his mission, about the precious items in his satchel that were meant for Sankt Theodule, and about the decision he had faced when the storm began. "You chose rightly, brother," Matthias said, his voice stronger now that he had been warmed and fed and had his leg tended. If you had tried to push on to the pass, you would have died. No man could survive out there in this storm. And if you had turned back, you would not have found me, and I would have frozen to death alone in the snow. God guided you to this place, to this moment. Your mission to Sankt Theodule must wait, but you have saved a life. Surely that is worth more than any reliquary or manuscript. Anselm was moved by these words, though a part of him still felt the weight of his failure to complete his task. He prayed silently, asking for forgiveness for his inability to reach Sankt Theodule, asking for strength to survive this trial, asking for protection for Matthias and his family, asking that the storm might pass and that they might somehow find their way to safety. The night was long beyond measure. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness of the cave, with only the fire and the howling storm to mark its passage. Anselm dozed fitfully, waking frequently to tend the fire, to check on Matthias, to pray the hours as best he could remember them without the bell tower to guide him. Each time he woke, he looked out at the storm, and each time it seemed as fierce as before, giving no sign of abating. But sometime in the deep hours before dawn, when the darkness was absolute and the cold most bitter, something changed in Matthias. He had been sleeping, but he began to shiver again, more violently than before, and when Anselm touched his forehead, it was burning with fever. The injury, the exposure, the shock of the accident, all of it was taking its toll. Matthias began to mutter and toss, and Anselm realized with growing alarm that the man was becoming delirious. He did what he could. He kept Matthias warm, fed him sips of water, bathed his face with melted snow to try to bring down the fever. And he prayed, oh how he prayed. He prayed with every fiber of his being, calling upon all the saints, upon the Virgin Mary, upon Christ himself. He recited every prayer he knew, every psalm he had memorized in his years in the monastery. And in his desperation, he did something he had been reluctant to do before. He opened his satchel and carefully withdrew the reliquary, the small silver box containing the bone fragment of Saint Columban. With trembling hands, Anselm held the reliquary and prayed over Matthias. He asked Saint Columban to intercede, to show mercy to this simple woodcutter who had done no wrong except to be in the wrong place when misfortune struck. He placed the reliquary gently on Matthias's chest, over his heart, and continued to pray, his voice steady and sure in the darkness, a counterpoint to the screaming wind outside. Saint Columban, you who traveled through hardship and danger to bring the light of Christ to dark places, look with mercy upon your servant Matthias. You who knew cold and hunger and the trials of the wilderness, comfort him now in his suffering. You who trusted in God's providence in all things, help us to trust now. And whether it was the power of prayer, or the natural course of illness, or the intercession of a saint from 6 centuries past, something did change. Matthias's shivering gradually subsided. His fevered muttering quieted. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened and steadied. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the snow still falling outside the cave, Matthias opened his eyes, clear and rational, and looked at Anselm with wonder. "I dreamed," he said softly, "that I was in a green valley in spring, and an old man with kind eyes was walking with me. He told me that I would live, that I would see my wife and children again, that I had more years ahead of me. And he said that I should always remember the monk who stayed with me in the cave, who chose my life over his duty." Anselm felt tears prick his eyes, tears that froze almost instantly on his cheeks in the bitter cold. He carefully replaced the reliquary in its wrappings and back in his satchel, his heart full of a strange mixture of joy and awe and profound humility. The dawn brought no real improvement in the weather. The blizzard continued through the second day, unrelenting in its fury. Anselm and Matthias remained in their cave, conserving their energy and their supplies. Anselm ventured out only briefly, staying close to the cave entrance, to gather more wood and to pack snow to melt for water. The world outside was transformed beyond recognition, buried under drifts taller than a man, with the shapes of trees and rocks turned into abstract sculptures of white. The cold was so intense that Anselm's breath seemed to freeze in his lungs, and he could spend only minutes outside before he had to retreat to the fire. The second day in the cave passed with agonizing slowness. Anselm and Matthias rationed their food carefully, knowing that their supplies were finite and that they had no way of knowing how long the storm would last. Anselm broke his oath cakes into halves, then quarters, making each piece last as long as possible. The dried meat, tough and salty, was divided with mathematical precision. The cheese was nearly gone, and Anselm gave the last portion to Matthias, insisting that the injured man needed the strength more than he did. They drank melted snow flavored with a few drops of the wine, making the small flask stretch far beyond what it was meant for. As they sat huddled by the fire, Matthias told more stories of his life, and Anselm found himself fascinated by the world beyond the monastery walls, a world he had barely known since his boyhood. Matthias spoke of the changing seasons in the village, of spring planting and autumn harvests, of festivals and market days, of weddings and births, and the simple joys of community life. He described his children with such tenderness that Anselm could almost see them. His eldest son, Jacob, already learning the woodcutter's trade at age 10, his daughter Maria, 8 years old and clever as a fox, and his youngest, little Hans, barely 3 and full of mischief. Matthias's voice would soften when he spoke of his wife, Greta, whom he had married when they were both barely more than children themselves. "She will be beside herself with worry," Matthias said, staring into the fire. "When I did not return yesterday, she would have known something was wrong. I am never late when I say I will be home. She will have gone to Father Wilhelm, and the whole village will be searching for me, but in this storm." He trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them. No one could search in such weather. No one could even leave their homes without risking death. Anselm reached out and gripped Matthias's shoulder. "When the storm breaks, we will find our way back. Your Greta will have her husband return to her, and your children will have their father. This I promise you." But even as he spoke these words of comfort, Anselm felt doubt gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Their wood supply was dwindling. The fire had to be kept going constantly, for if it went out, they would freeze within hours in the terrible cold. And even if the storm did eventually pass, how would they make their way back? Matthias could not walk, and Anselm, while strong for a monk, was not a large man. Could he support Matthias's weight through deep snow, over rough terrain, all the way back to Eisenberg? The distance that had taken him half a day to climb would be far more challenging on the descent, especially with an injured companion. That night, the second night in the cave, was even colder than the first. The fire seemed to give less warmth somehow, as if the cold itself was a living force that grew stronger with each passing hour, pressing against their small circle of light and heat with malevolent intent. Anselm found himself thinking of his cell back at the monastery, a place he had often found uncomfortably cold and drafty, and he would have given almost anything to be back there now, wrapped in his thin blanket, listening to the distant sounds of his brother monks breathing in sleep. He thought of Father Dominic, who would by now be wondering what had happened to him. The old abbot would be worried, perhaps praying special prayers for his safe return, perhaps even organizing some kind of search once the storm passed. And he thought of the monks at St. Theodule, still waiting for their precious items, unaware that the brother who was meant to deliver them was trapped in a cave on the wrong side of the mountain pass. The thought of his failure, of the trust that had been placed in him and his inability to fulfill it, weighed on Anselm like a physical burden. But then he would look at Matthias, sleeping fitfully by the fire, his broken leg splintered and bound, his breathing steady and strong despite the fever that still came and went in waves, and Anselm would remember what the woodcutter had said. He had saved a life. A man who might have frozen alone in the snow was alive because Anselm had heard his call and had chosen to respond. A father would return to his children, a husband to his wife. Surely, as Matthias had said, this was worth more than any manuscript or reliquary. And yet the conflict tore at him. The monk who had been trained from boyhood to place duty and obedience above all else, now forced to weigh one duty against another. In the darkest part of that second night, when the wind seemed to shake the very mountain itself, Anselm prayed not the formal prayers of the liturgy, but spoke to God as he had not done since he was a small child, before the fever had taken his mother and sisters, before he had learned to hide his heart behind the walls of monastic discipline. "Lord," he whispered, his breath white in the dim firelight, "I do not understand your purpose in this. I tried to do what was right, to complete the task given to me, to serve you and your church as I have vowed to do. But now I am here, trapped by this storm, unable to move forward or back. I have failed in my mission, and yet I have saved a man's life. Are these two things equal in your eyes? Please, Lord, give me a sign that I have not displeased you, that my choices were not in vain." No voice answered him from the darkness. No angel appeared in radiant light. But as Anselm knelt there in prayer, feeling the cold seep through his robes and into his very bones, a strange peace settled over him. It was not the absence of doubt or fear, but something deeper, a certainty that transcended understanding. He had done what he could with the circumstances he had been given. He had chosen compassion over duty, mercy over mission, and if that was wrong, then he would accept whatever judgment came. But deep in his heart, in a place beyond words or rational thought, he felt that it was not wrong, that perhaps this was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The third day dawned gray and cold, but something was different. Anselm woke to a silence that was almost shocking after days of constant howling wind. He lay still for a moment, listening, hardly daring to believe it. The storm had stopped. He crawled to the cave entrance, his muscles stiff and protesting after so long cramped in the small space, and looked out at the transformed world. Snow lay everywhere, deeper than he had ever seen, sculpted by the wind into drifts and shapes that were both beautiful and terrifying. Some drifts were taller than two men standing one atop the other. Trees were buried to their middle branches, and many had been broken by the weight of ice and snow. Their trunks snapped like twigs. The sky above was still overcast, a flat gray that promised more snow to come. But for now, the air was still, and the only sound was the occasional soft thump of snow sliding off an overladen branch. Anselm's heart sank as he surveyed the landscape. How could they possibly make their way through this? Even if he had been alone and uninjured, the task would have been nearly impossible. With Matthias unable to walk, it seemed hopeless. But they could not stay in the cave indefinitely. Their food was almost gone, reduced to a few crumbs of oat cake and a small piece of dried meat. The wood, too, was running dangerously low. They had perhaps enough to keep the fire going for one more day, maybe two if they were very careful. After that, they would have no choice but to venture out or freeze. He returned to the cave and gently woke Matthias, who had been sleeping more peacefully now that his fever had fully broken. Anselm helped him sit up and gave him a small portion of their remaining food and some water. As they ate their meager breakfast, Anselm explained what he had seen outside. "We must try to make our way back to Eisenberg," Anselm said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "We cannot stay here much longer. I will help you, support you as much as I can. We will go slowly, rest often. It may take us many hours, perhaps even another full day, but we must try." Matthias nodded, his face set with determination. "I will not slow you down more than I must, brother. I will use a branch as a crutch, and I will hop on my good leg. Between the two of us, we will manage somehow. My Greta used to say I was too stubborn to die, and today we shall test the truth of that." They prepared themselves as best they could. Anselm wrapped the oiled cloth that had protected the manuscript around Matthias's shoulders, adding an extra layer of warmth. He fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy branch, padding the top with strips of wool. He made sure the precious items in his satchel were secure, though now they felt less like treasures and more like anchors, weighing him down. For a brief moment, he considered leaving them in the cave, lightening his burden, but he could not bring himself to do it. Whatever else happened, he would not abandon the sacred trust that had been placed in him. With the fire carefully extinguished and scattered, leaving no trace of their presence except for the ashes, they emerged from the cave into the cold, still world. The sun had managed to break through the clouds in one spot, sending a single shaft of pale light down onto the snow-covered landscape. And in that moment, despite everything, Anselm was struck by the terrible beauty of it all. This storm that had nearly killed them had also created something magnificent, a crystalline wilderness that sparkled and shone like diamonds scattered across the earth. But there was no time to marvel at beauty. They had to move. Anselm positioned himself on Matthias's left side, taking the injured man's arm across his shoulders, while Matthias used the crutch on his right side. Together, step by agonizing step, they began to make their way back toward where the path should be. The snow was deep, sometimes coming up to Anselm's waist, and each step required enormous effort. They would take 10 steps and then have to rest, gasping in the thin, cold air. Then 10 more steps and rest again. The world was utterly silent except for the sound of their labored breathing and the crunch and squeak of snow under their feet. Once they heard a deep boom like thunder, and Anselm's heart leaped with fear, thinking another storm was coming. But then he realized it was the sound of ice breaking on a distant river or lake, a natural sound but one that seemed ominous in the vast stillness. They saw no animals, no birds, nothing living except themselves, as if they were the last 2 people in a world that had been abandoned by all other life. Hours passed in this way. The pale sun tracked slowly across the sky, giving little warmth but at least providing some sense of direction. Anselm navigated by instinct and memory, trying to retrace the route he had taken 2 days before, though the landscape was so changed by snow that he could barely recognize any landmarks. At one point, they came upon a tree that Anselm remembered, a massive oak that stood alone in what had been a clearing, its ancient branches now weighted with snow. Seeing it filled him with hope, for it meant they were indeed heading in the right direction, that they were not simply wandering in circles. They stopped to rest in the shelter of the oak, and Anselm shared the last of their food with Matthias. It was pitifully little, barely enough to call a meal, but they ate it slowly, making it last, and washed it down with snow that they melted in their mouths. Matthias's face was gray with pain and exhaustion, and Anselm could see that every movement cost him dearly. The broken leg, even splinted, was being jarred and stressed with each hop and stumble, and Anselm worried that they might be causing further injury. But what choice did they have? To stay still was to die. "Tell me about your family again," Anselm said as they rested, trying to keep Matthias's spirits up, trying to give him something to focus on besides the pain and cold. "Tell me about Greta, about your children." And Matthias, his voice weak but steady, spoke again of his life, painting pictures with words of a home that seemed impossibly distant now, impossibly warm and safe and normal. He told Anselm about how he had met Greta at the village well when they were both 14, how she had dropped her bucket and he had retrieved it for her, how her laugh had made his heart skip. He described teaching Jakob to handle an axe, the pride he felt when the boy made his first clean cut. He talked about Maria's love of singing, how she would make up songs about everything she saw, filling their small house with music. And little Hans, who followed his father everywhere, mimicking his every action, who would cry when Matthias left for work and celebrate like it was a feast day when he returned. "They are my world, brother," Matthias said, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Every tree I cut, every log I haul, it is for them. So they will have food in their bellies and warmth in winter and perhaps, if God is kind, a better life than I had. And Greta, she is the strength of our home. When I am weary, she lifts me up. When I doubt, she believes. She is a better person than I will ever be, and I do not deserve her, but I thank God every day that she chose me." Anselm listened to these words, and something shifted inside him, some understanding that he had not quite grasped before. He had spent 17 years in the monastery, dedicating his life to prayer and study, to the preservation of knowledge and the service of God. He had thought this was the highest calling, the most noble purpose a man could have. And perhaps it was for him, for the particular path God had set him on. But listening to Matthias speak of his wife and children, of the simple, profound love that bound them together, Anselm realized that there were many ways to serve God, many paths to holiness. Matthias, in his daily labor and his devotion to his family, was living out his own sacred vocation, no less important or meaningful than the life of any monk or priest. They set out again as the sun began to descend toward the horizon, knowing that they must make as much progress as possible before darkness fell. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Anselm could feel his body beginning to falter. He had not eaten a proper meal in days, had slept little, had expended enormous energy in caring for Matthias, and now in helping him travel through the deep snow. His hands and feet were numb, his face felt frozen, and his muscles trembled with exhaustion. But he pushed on, step after step, because there was no other choice, because Matthias's life depended on him, because to give up was to die. As twilight began to gather, painting the snow in shades of blue and purple, they crested a rise and looked down into a valley. And there, like a miracle, like an answer to every prayer Anselm had uttered in the past 3 days, were lights. The village of Eisenberg lay before them, no more than a mile distant, its houses sending up columns of smoke that rose straight into the still evening air, its windows glowing with warm firelight. Anselm felt something break inside him at the sight, some dam of emotion that he had been holding back, and he found himself weeping openly, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down his frozen face. "Look, Matthias," he said, his voice choked. "Look, you're home. We have made it. God has brought us through." Matthias, too, was weeping, leaning heavily on Anselm and the crutch, his injured leg dangling useless. "I see it, brother. I see it. My Greta is there waiting for me. My children are there. O God, O merciful God, we are going to make it." But they were not there yet. The last mile proved to be the hardest of all, for the slope was steep and the snow treacherous. Twice Matthias stumbled and nearly fell, and it took all of Anselm's strength to keep him upright. The light was fading fast, and the cold was becoming brutal as the sun disappeared completely. Anselm found himself praying with each step, sometimes just repeating the same word over and over. Please, please, please. And then, when he thought he could not take another step, when his legs were shaking so badly he feared they would buckle beneath him, they were on the outskirts of the village. A dog began to bark, and then another, and suddenly there were shouts and the sound of doors being flung open. People came running through the snow, dark figures silhouetted against the light of their houses, and Anselm heard a woman's voice crying out, "Matthias! Oh God, it is Matthias!" Greta reached them first, a small woman in a rough wool dress and shawl, her face streaked with tears, and she threw her arms around her husband, heedless of his injured leg, sobbing his name over and over. Then there were more people, and hands were taking Matthias from Anselm, supporting him, carrying him, and someone was wrapping a blanket around Anselm's shoulders. And Father Wilhelm was there, his round face split by a huge smile, saying, "Brother Anselm, blessed be God, we thought you were lost. We thought both of you were lost." The next hours passed in a blur. Anselm was brought to Father Wilhelm's house, where the fire was built up high, and Hilda fussed over him like a mother hen, forcing him to drink hot broth and stripping off his wet, frozen clothes to replace them with dry wool. Matthias was carried to his own home, where the village healer, an old woman named Agnes, set his broken leg properly and dosed him with herbs for the pain and to prevent infection. The whole village seemed to be in an uproar, with people coming and going, bringing food and offering prayers of thanksgiving. Anselm sat by Father Wilhelm's fire, wrapped in a blanket, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot broth, and told the story of what had happened. He described hearing Matthias's call, finding him injured, taking shelter in the cave, the long days of the storm, and the journey back. Father Wilhelm listened with shining eyes, and when Anselm finished, the priest gripped his hands and said, "Brother Anselm, you are a hero. You saved this man's life at great risk to your own. Matthias is beloved in this village, and his family is dear to us all. You have given us back a husband, a father, a friend. We are forever in your debt." But Anselm shook his head wearily. "I am no hero, Father Wilhelm. I simply did what anyone would have done, and in doing so, I failed in my true mission. I did not reach Sankt Theodule. I did not deliver the items entrusted to me. I have brought shame to my monastery and to Father Dominic, who trusted me." Father Wilhelm was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then he said softly, "Brother Anselm, do you remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? The priest and the Levite who passed by the injured man on the road, they had important religious duties to attend to, sacred obligations. They were on their way to the temple to perform their offices. And yet Christ condemned them for leaving the injured man to die. The Samaritan, who stopped to help, who put another's need before his own plans and duties, he was the one who fulfilled the law of love. You, Brother Anselm, are the Good Samaritan of this story. You chose mercy over duty, compassion over obligation, and in doing so, you have fulfilled a higher law. These words settled into Anselm's heart, easing some of the guilt and failure he had been carrying. He wanted to believe them, wanted to accept that he had made the right choice, but 17 years of monastic discipline had taught him to question his own desires and motivations. Had he truly chosen rightly, or had he simply been unable to face the hardship of continuing through the storm? Had he saved Matthias out of genuine compassion, or out of fear for his own life? These questions would trouble him for days to come. He slept that night in a real bed, soft and warm, in Father Wilhelm's guest room. And though his body was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, his mind would not rest. He dreamed troubled dreams of snow and wind, of Father Dominic's disappointed face, of Matthias frozen in the snow, of the reliquary slipping from his numb fingers and disappearing into a white void. He woke several times disoriented, unsure for a moment where he was, and each time had to remind himself that he was safe, that Matthias was safe, that the storm had passed. The next day dawned clear and cold, with a sharp blue sky that seemed scrubbed clean by the blizzard. Anselm rose for his prayers, his body stiff and sore, and found Father Wilhelm already awake, preparing to say Mass. The village church was packed that morning, filled with people who had come to give thanks for the miraculous survival of Matthias and the brave monk who had saved him. Anselm stood in the back, uncomfortable with the attention, but Greta found him after the service and embraced him, weeping again, thanking him in a voice thick with emotion. "Brother Anselm, you gave me back my husband. You gave my children back their father. There are no words sufficient to express what you have done for us. You are in our prayers always, and if ever you or your monastery have need of anything we can provide, you have only to ask." Her children were with her. Jakob, tall for his age and solemn, who shook Anselm's hand with the grip of a man. Maria, with bright eyes and a shy smile, who presented him with a small wooden carving she had made, a rough figure of a monk that she had obviously worked on for hours, and little Hans, who hid behind his mother's skirts but peeked out at Anselm with curious eyes. Seeing them, knowing that they still had their father because of choices he had made in the cave, Anselm felt the weight of guilt lift a little more from his shoulders. He went to visit Matthias later that day and found the woodcutter propped up in bed, his leg in a proper splint now, his color much better. The small house smelled of bread baking and herbs, and was warm and cozy, in a way that made Anselm realize how much he had missed such simple domestic comfort. Matthias gripped his hand fiercely and said, "Brother, I have been thinking about what happened, about everything you did for me. And I want you to know that when I am healed, when I can walk again, I am going to make the journey to your monastery. I want to thank Father Dominic properly, and I want to make an offering to the brothers there. It is little enough compared to the gift of life you gave me." They talked for a while longer, and then Anselm returned to Father Wilhelm's house to consider his next steps. The path over the mountains would be impassable for weeks, perhaps months, until the snow melted in the spring. There was no way he could reach St. Theodule now, not until the seasons turned. He would have to return to his own monastery, to explain what had happened and accept whatever consequences Father Dominic deemed appropriate. But Father Wilhelm had other news. "Brother Anselm," he said that evening as they sat by the fire, "I have sent word to Sankt Theodule by a different route. There is a longer path that circles around the mountains rather than going over them. It will take a messenger more than a week to travel it, but it is passable even in winter for those who know the way. I have explained in my letter what occurred, how you came upon Matthias in dire need and chose to save his life rather than continue your journey. I have assured Abbot Gregor that the items he needs are safe with you and will be delivered as soon as travel over the pass is possible again." Anselm felt tears prick his eyes again, overwhelmed by this kindness. "Father Wilhelm, I am grateful beyond measure. But what of my own monastery? Father Dominic will be worried sick about me. He may think I perished in the storm." "I have sent word there as well," Father Wilhelm said with a gentle smile. "Another messenger traveling north. I have told Father Dominic that you are safe, that you are here in Eisenberg recovering from your ordeal, and that you will return to St. Gallen as soon as you are able to travel. Be at peace, brother. All is being taken care of." Anselm spent a week in Eisenberg, recovering his strength and waiting for the initial soreness and exhaustion to fade from his body. The village, grateful for his saving of Matthias, treated him like an honored guest. He was given the best portions at meals, offered the warmest spot by the fire, showered with small gifts and tokens of appreciation. But Anselm was uncomfortable with such attention. He was, after all, just a simple monk who had done what anyone with compassion would have done. He longed for the quiet routine of his monastery, for the familiar rhythm of prayers and work, for the anonymity of his cell. During that week, however, he learned much about village life that he had never known before. He spent time with the families, blessed their homes, listened to their confessions when they sought him out. He watched the children play in the snow, building structures and having snowball fights, their laughter ringing clear in the cold air. He helped where he could, though his hands were better suited to holding a quill than an axe or a hammer. And he came to understand that the life he had chosen, the cloistered existence of a monk, was only one way among many to seek and serve God. On the 8th day after their ordeal, Anselm prepared to return to St. Gallen. The weather had remained clear, and the roads, though still difficult, were passable for a man traveling alone. Father Wilhelm provided him with fresh provisions, warm clothing to replace what had been damaged in the storm, and a sturdy walking staff. Matthias, though still bedridden, insisted on being carried to the door to bid Anselm farewell, and Greta and the children stood with him, all of them weeping as they said goodbye to the monk who had become so dear to them in such a short time. "Go with God, Brother Anselm," Matthias said, his voice thick with emotion. "And know that you are always welcome in our home, always considered a member of our family. What you did for us will never be forgotten." The journey back to St. Gallen took 2 days, for Anselm traveled slowly, still regaining his full strength. The landscape he passed through bore the scars of the great storm. Fallen trees blocked the path in places, requiring detours. Fields were buried under snow that would not melt for months. He passed farmhouses where people were still digging out, clearing paths to their barns to tend to livestock that had survived the blizzard's fury. Everyone he encountered had a story to tell of those terrible 3 days, of fear and cold and narrow survival. When he finally saw the familiar walls of St. Gallen rising before him, Anselm's heart swelled with a complex mixture of emotions: relief at being home, joy at seeing the place that had shaped him, but also apprehension about facing Father Dominic and explaining his failure to complete the mission. He reached the gate as bells were ringing for vespers, and the brother porter, seeing him approach, let out a cry of joy and rushed to embrace him, something utterly against protocol, but done anyway in the surge of emotion at seeing him alive and well. Word spread quickly through the monastery, and by the time Anselm had entered the main courtyard, it seemed every brother was streaming out of the chapel, their prayers abandoned in the excitement of his return. They surrounded him, asking questions, touching his cloak as if to assure themselves he was real and not a ghost. And then the crowd parted, and Father Dominic appeared, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, his old face creased with more wrinkles than Anselm remembered, his eyes wet with tears. "My son," the abbot said simply, opening his arms. Anselm went to him and embraced him, and felt the old man's thin frame shaking with sobs. "My dear son, I thought I had sent you to your death. When the storm came, when days passed with no word, I thought. But you are here, you are alive. Dio gracias, Dio gracias." They went to Father Dominic's chambers, and there, by the familiar fire in the familiar room, Anselm told his story. He held nothing back, describing every detail: the meeting with Matthias, the decision to shelter in the cave, the 3 days of the storm, the journey back to Eisenberg. He described his doubts and his prayers, his guilt at not completing his mission, his conflict between duty and mercy. And when he was finished, he knelt before Father Dominic and bowed his head. "Father Abbot, I have failed in the task you gave me. The items you entrusted to me have not been delivered to Sanct Theodule. I chose to save a man's life rather than fulfill my vow of obedience. If you deem it appropriate to punish me, to impose penance, I will accept whatever judgment you give." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ticking of a water clock in the corner. Then Father Dominic spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Brother Anselm, look at me." Anselm raised his head and met the abbot's eyes. "Do you truly believe that I would punish you for saving a man's life? Do you truly think that God would be displeased with your choice? My dear son, when I gave you this mission, I did not know that it would place you in such danger, that it would test you in ways I never imagined. But now that I hear your story, I see the hand of providence in all that occurred. You were meant to find Matthias. You were meant to shelter him and care for him. The items for Sanct Theodule, precious as they are mere objects. They can wait. But Matthias could not wait. His life hung in the balance, and you chose rightly. The old abbot stood and placed his hands on Anselm's head in blessing. You have brought honor to this monastery, and to your vows, not shame. You have lived out the very essence of what it means to follow Christ, to lay down your life for another, to show mercy, to love your neighbor as yourself. I am proud of you, my son. More proud than I can express. These words broke something in Anselm, some final barrier he had been holding against the flood of emotion. He wept then as he had not wept since childhood, great heaving sobs that shook his thin frame. Father Dominic held him as a father would hold a son, and the other monks who had gathered outside the door, listening, added their own tears to his. In the days that followed his return, Brother Anselm found himself struggling to settle back into the familiar rhythms of monastic life. The bells still rang at their appointed hours, calling him to prayer. The scriptorium still smelled of ink and vellum, still echoed with the soft scratch of quills on parchment. The refectory still served its simple meals of bread and vegetables and thin beer. Everything was exactly as it had been before he left, and yet everything felt different, as if he had returned not just from a journey through the mountains, but from a journey through some deeper territory of the soul. His brother monks treated him with a mixture of reverence and curiosity that made him uncomfortable. They wanted to hear his story again and again, wanted details about the storm, about the cave, about Matthias and his family. Brother Friedrich, his friend from the scriptorium, would sit with him in the evenings and ask endless questions, his eyes wide with an almost childlike wonder at this adventure that had befallen his quiet companion. Brother Otto brought him extra portions at meals, insisting he needed to regain the weight he had lost during his ordeal. Even the younger novices looked at him differently now, with a kind of awe that made Anselm want to shrink into his cell and disappear. But it was in the quiet moments, alone in his cell or walking in the monastery gardens where the snow still lay thick between the bare trees, that Anselm struggled most. He found himself unable to pray the way he once had, unable to sink into that state of contemplative focus that had always come so naturally to him. His mind would wander to Eisenberg, to the small house where Matthias was slowly healing, to Greta and the children going about their daily lives. He wondered how Jakob was managing the woodcutter's work in his father's absence, whether Maria was still making up her songs, whether little Hans still asked when the monk who had saved his papa would visit again. He thought often about what Father Wilhelm had said about the Good Samaritan, about choosing mercy over duty. And he thought about Father Dominic's words of pride and blessing. But underneath his gratitude for their understanding and support, there remained a nagging question that would not leave him alone. Had he truly chosen rightly? Or had he simply been fortunate that his choice had turned out well? What if Matthias had died despite his care? What if they had both frozen in that cave? Would his decision still be considered righteous then? Or would it be condemned as foolish disobedience that had resulted in 2 deaths instead of 1? These questions troubled his sleep, invaded his prayers, distracted him from his work. He found himself copying the same line twice, or missing words entirely, mistakes he had never made in all his years in the scriptorium. Brother Martin, the master of the scriptorium, gently corrected him but said nothing about the unusual errors. Everyone seemed to understand that Brother Anselm needed time to find his balance again, to integrate the extraordinary experience he had lived through with the ordinary life he had returned to. Winter deepened around the monastery. More snow fell, though nothing like the great blizzard that had trapped Anselm and Matthias. The days were short and dark, the nights long and cold. Inside the thick stone walls, the brothers kept their routines, a small island of order and prayer in a world that seemed frozen in time. Christmas came and went, celebrated with special masses and the rare treat of spiced wine. Epiphany followed, and then the slow, gray weeks of January stretched ahead. It was during this time that Father Dominic called Anselm to his chambers again. The old abbot looked even more frail than he had at Christmas, his hands shaking more noticeably as he gestured for Anselm to sit. A fire burned in the hearth, but it seemed to give little warmth, and both men kept their cloaks wrapped tight around them. "Brother Anselm," Father Dominic began, his voice soft and thoughtful, "I have been watching you these past weeks, and I see that you are troubled. You carry a burden that goes beyond mere exhaustion or the after-effects of your ordeal. Tell me, my son, what weighs upon your heart?" Anselm hesitated, unsure how to put his confusion into words. But Father Dominic had always been able to draw out the truth from him, and after a moment he began to speak, haltingly at first, but then with growing fluency. "Father Abbot, I am grateful beyond measure for your understanding and your blessing. I know that you believe I chose rightly when I stopped to help Matthias rather than continuing to Sanct Theodule. And yet, I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about duty and obedience, about the life I have chosen here in the monastery. For 17 years, I have been taught that my will should be nothing, that I should follow the rule and my superiors without question, that personal desires and individual judgments should be subsumed into the greater discipline of our order. But in that moment when I heard Matthias calling for help, I made a choice that contradicted my orders. I chose to follow my own conscience, my own sense of what was right, rather than the explicit command you had given me to deliver those items to Sanct Theodule. And now I do not know how to reconcile these things. How can I be both obedient and free to follow my conscience? How can I surrender my will and yet make moral choices?" Father Dominic was quiet for a long while, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but carried the weight of long years of wisdom. "Brother Anselm, you have asked one of the most profound questions that any person dedicated to God must grapple with. The tension between obedience and conscience, between submission and moral agency, is not easily resolved, and I would be a poor spiritual father if I pretended to have simple answers for you. But let me share with you some thoughts, born of my own long years of struggle with these same questions. The rule we follow, the vow of obedience we take, these are not meant to crush the human spirit or to turn us into unthinking automatons. Rather, they are meant to free us from the tyranny of our own ego, from the constant demands of our pride and selfish desires. In submitting our will to rule and to legitimate authority, we create space for God to work in us, to shape us, to transform us into the people we are meant to become. This is good and necessary, especially in our early years of formation when we are still learning to distinguish between the voice of the Spirit and the voice of our own wants. But, and this is crucial, this obedience is not blind or absolute. It is always bound by the higher law of love. When Christ was asked what the greatest commandment was, he did not say, "Obey your superiors." He said to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. These two commandments, he taught, contain all the law and the prophets. Everything else, all our rules and regulations and structures of authority, must serve these primary obligations. They cannot contradict them. When you heard Matthias crying for help, you were faced with a choice. Continue on the path of formal obedience to the letter of your orders, or stop to help a man in desperate need. Both choices had validity. Both involved genuine goods. But in that moment, the law of love, the commandment to care for your neighbor, took precedence over the administrative task of delivering items to another monastery. You did not disobey out of laziness or selfishness or pride. You disobeyed out of love, out of recognition that a human life is more precious than even the most sacred objects. This is not license to disregard our vows whenever we please, to follow every whim under the guise of conscience. Genuine moral discernment is difficult and requires humility, prayer, and often the counsel of wise guides. But neither is our obedience meant to be so rigid that it leaves no room for the unexpected movements of grace, for the sudden demands of mercy, for those moments when God calls us to step outside our plans and structures to respond to genuine human need. You, Brother Anselm, faced such a moment, and you responded as Christ would have responded. You stopped for the man beaten by robbers on the side of the road. You bound up his wounds and cared for him, even though it meant setting aside your other obligations. This was not disobedience in any true sense. It was, rather, a deeper obedience to the fundamental law that governs all of Christian life, the law of love. Father Dominic paused, coughing slightly, and took a sip of water from a cup at his side. Anselm sat in stunned silence, feeling as if a knot that had been pulled tight in his chest for weeks was slowly beginning to loosen. The abbot continued, his voice growing stronger. "I want to tell you something else, my son, something I have never told anyone in this monastery. When I was a young monk, perhaps a year older than you are now, I was given a task by my abbot. I was to travel to Rome to deliver an important letter to the Holy Father himself. It was a great honor and a great responsibility, and I set out with my heart full of pride and determination to succeed. On my journey, I came to a small village that had been struck by plague. The people were dying, and their priest had fled in fear, leaving them without the sacraments, without comfort, without help. I could have passed through quickly, keeping to myself, protecting myself from infection, continuing on to Rome to fulfill my mission. That is what the letter of my orders would have suggested. But I could not do it. I could not leave those people to die without the comfort of the church. So I stayed. I stayed for 2 months, hearing confessions, giving last rites, burying the dead, caring for the sick. Many died in my arms. I myself fell ill and nearly died. And by the time I recovered and continued to roam, the letter I carried was months late, and the matter it concerned had been resolved through other means. My journey had been, in a practical sense, pointless. When I returned to my monastery, I expected to be punished, perhaps even expelled from the order. But my abbot, a wise old man much like I am now, embraced me and said, "Brother Dominic, you have learned the most important lesson a monk can learn. That people matter more than policies, that souls matter more than schedules, that love is the only rule that finally matters." I have never forgotten those words, and they have guided me through all my years as abbot of this monastery. And now I pass them on to you. People matter more than policies, Anselm. Souls matter more than schedules. Love is the only rule that finally matters. Anselm found himself weeping again, but these were different tears from those he had shed before. These were tears of relief, of release, of deep gratitude for this gift of wisdom that Father Dominic had given him. He knelt and kissed the old abbot's hand, and Father Dominic blessed him, making the sign of the cross over his bowed head. "Go in peace, my son," the abbot said softly. "Return to your work with a light heart. You have done well, and you are exactly where you are meant to be." In the weeks that followed this conversation, Anselm did find peace. Not the complete absence of doubt or questions. He was too thoughtful a person for that, but a deeper peace that could hold the questions without being overwhelmed by them. He returned to his work in the scriptorium with renewed focus, his copying once again accurate and beautiful. He prayed the hours with genuine devotion, though his prayers had changed, becoming less formal and more personal, more conversational. He spoke to God now as he might speak to a friend, sharing his thoughts and feelings, asking for guidance, expressing gratitude. And he thought often of Matthias and his family, wondering how they fared as winter slowly loosened its grip on the land. February came, then March, and the days began to lengthen perceptibly. The snow started to melt, first in patches, then in earnest, turning the monastery grounds into a muddy expanse that was nearly impassable. Streams swelled with runoff, and the river that ran past St. Gallen roared with increased volume, carrying chunks of ice downstream like a procession of frozen ships. It was in early April, when the first green shoots were beginning to appear in the monastery garden, and the air had lost its bitter edge. That word came from St. Theodule. A messenger arrived, a young monk on a sturdy pony, carrying letters sealed with wax. One letter was for Father Dominic from Abbot Gregor. The other was addressed to Brother Anselm specifically. Anselm received his letter in the scriptorium, and with trembling hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The script was elegant, the work of someone well trained in the scribal arts. He read, "Brother Anselm, Greetings in Christ our Lord. I write to you from Sankt Theodule, where we have heard the full account of your journey and the trials you faced. We received Father Wilhelm's letter many weeks ago, explaining what occurred, and we have been in constant prayer for you and for the brave woodcutter whose life you saved. First, let me assure you that you have incurred no blame or censure from us for the delay in delivering the items we requested. On the contrary, we hold you in the highest regard for your compassion and courage. The manuscript and blessed oils and holy reliquary are precious to us, but they are, after all, merely tools for our ministry. They can wait, a human life cannot. Second, I want you to know that your story has been a profound source of inspiration to our community here. We have reflected deeply on the choices you faced and the decision you made, and it has led to rich discussions among our brothers about the nature of our vocation, about the relationship between duty and mercy, about what it truly means to follow Christ. In a sense, your journey has already borne fruit here, even before the physical items you carry have arrived. Third, I write to extend an invitation. When the mountain pass is fully clear and travel is safe again, we would be honored if you would complete your journey to Sankt Theodule, not merely to deliver the items, though we still need them, but to spend some time with us, to share your story more fully, to allow our brothers to learn from your experience. If Father Dominic can spare you for a few weeks, we would welcome you as a guest and as a brother. Finally, know that you are in our daily prayers. We ask God to grant you peace and wisdom, and to help you integrate this extraordinary experience into your ongoing life of service. May the Lord bless you and keep you, Brother Anselm. In Christ, Abbot Gregor of Sankt Theodule. Anselm read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a warmth spread through his chest. There was no condemnation here, no judgment, only understanding and grace. He took the letter to Father Dominic, who read it with a broad smile, and immediately gave his permission for Anselm to make the journey once the pass was clear. "You will complete your mission after all, my son," Father Dominic said, his eyes twinkling. "Though in God's time rather than ours, and with far greater purpose than we originally imagined." As spring advanced and the world turned green and alive again, Anselm prepared for his second attempt to reach Sankt Theodule. But before he left, something unexpected happened. One warm afternoon in late April, when the apple trees in the monastery orchard were beginning to bloom, a small group of visitors arrived at the monastery gate. The porter came rushing to find Anselm in the scriptorium, his face flushed with excitement. "Brother Anselm, you must come quickly. There are visitors here to see you." Puzzled, Anselm set down his quill and followed the porter to the gate. There, standing in the afternoon sunshine, was Matthias, leaning on a cane but standing on both legs, his broken limb healed enough to bear weight. Beside him was Greta, and around them clustered Jakob, Maria, and little Hans. They had traveled all the way from Eisenberg to St. Gallen, a journey of 2 days, just to see Anselm again. The reunion was joyful and tearful. Matthias embraced Anselm with the strength of a man who had regained his health, and Greta kissed his cheeks in the continental fashion, blessing him over and over. The children were shy at first in the imposing presence of the monastery, but Maria soon presented Anselm with another of her carvings. This one, a small wooden bird that she had painted in bright colors. Jakob shook his hand solemnly and thanked him for saving his father. And little Hans, no longer quite so little as when Anselm had last seen him, asked in a piping voice if all the monks lived in the big stone house. Father Dominic welcomed them warmly and invited them to stay as guests of the monastery for a few days. It was highly unusual to have a family with small children within the cloister, but the abbot declared that these were exceptional circumstances, and the brothers gladly made accommodations. The monastery guest house was opened and aired, and the kitchens prepared special meals for the visitors. During their stay, Matthias told Anselm about his recovery. The leg had healed well under Agnes the healer's care, though it pained him in cold weather and probably always would. He had returned to his work as a woodcutter, though he moved more slowly now and relied more on Jakob's help. The family was well. The village had survived the terrible winter with only a few losses, and life was returning to its normal rhythms. But there was another reason for their visit, Matthias explained. He had brought a gift for the monastery, a gift from all the people of Eisenberg who had been touched by Anselm's sacrifice. It was a donation of timber, a whole wagon load of the finest oak, carefully selected and transported to St. Gallen at great effort and expense. The wood would be used to repair the monastery's aging library shelves and to build new benches for the chapel. "It is a small thing," Matthias said humbly, "compared to what you did for us. But it is given with full hearts, Brother Anselm." Every family in Eisenberg contributed something, whether labor or coin or prayer, to make this gift possible. "We wanted you and your brother monks to know that we will never forget what happened in that cave, what you sacrificed, what you risked." Father Dominic accepted the gift on behalf of the monastery with deep gratitude, and that evening he held a special service of thanksgiving in the chapel. The family from Eisenberg sat in places of honor, and Brother Anselm stood with them, no longer uncomfortable with the attention, but accepting it with humility as a reflection of God's grace working through imperfect human vessels. On the final evening of their visit, Anselm walked with Matthias through the monastery grounds, showing him the scriptorium where he worked, the gardens where he prayed, the small cell where he slept. They talked of many things, of the months that had passed since the blizzard, of how both their lives had been changed by those days in the cave. "You know, Brother Anselm," Matthias said as they stood looking out over the valley below the monastery, "I think God put us both in that cave for a reason. Not just so you could save my life, though I thank Him for that every day, but so we could both learn something important. I learned that there are men in this world who will sacrifice everything for a stranger, who live their faith in action and not just in words. And perhaps you learned," he paused, searching for the right words, "that holiness comes in many forms," Anselm finished softly. That God's love can be found not just in prayer and scripture, but in the embrace of a wife for her husband, in children's laughter, in a woodcutter's honest labor, in a village's care for its own. Matthias nodded, his weathered face breaking into a smile. Exactly so, brother. Exactly so. The family departed the next morning amid more tears and embraces and promises to keep each other in prayer. Little Hans cried and had to be carried away by his father, reaching back toward Anselm with chubby arms. Maria made Anselm promise to visit Eisenberg again someday. Jakob, growing into young manhood, said simply, "You are always welcome in our home, Brother Anselm." Always. As Anselm watched them disappear down the road that led away from the monastery, he felt a curious mixture of sadness and completion. That chapter of his life was closing, but it had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He was no longer the same monk who had set out on a winter journey all those months ago, confident in his mission and certain of his purpose. He had been tested, broken open, and reformed into something both more humble and more human. 2 weeks later, in mid-May, when the world was green and warm and the mountain pass was finally clear, Brother Anselm set out once again for Sankt Theodule. This time, Father Dominic sent 2 other monks with him, both young and strong, to assist in the journey and to ensure his safety. They carried not only the original items, the manuscript, the blessed oils, and the reliquary, but also gifts from St. Gallen to Sankt Theodule, books copied by the brothers, preserved fruits from the monastery orchards, and letters of fraternal greeting. The journey was long but uneventful. The weather was perfect, with warm days and cool nights, and the path through the mountains was clear and well marked. They passed through Eisenberg on the first day, and Father Wilhelm insisted they stay the night. Anselm visited Matthias and his family again, and the reunion was sweet though briefer than before. He blessed their home, prayed with them, and in the morning continued on his way. The climb to the pass took most of the second day. As they ascended, Anselm found himself looking for the place where he had heard Matthias's call, where he had left the path to search for the injured man. He found it eventually, or thought he did, a spot where the forest opened slightly and rocks jutted from the earth. But in the spring sunshine, with flowers blooming and birds singing, it seemed impossible that this had been the site of such danger and drama. The cave where they had sheltered was there, smaller and less impressive than he remembered, already being reclaimed by vegetation and time. He stood there for a long moment, his 2 companion monks waiting patiently a short distance away. He remembered the cold, the fear, the uncertainty. He remembered the choice he had faced and the decision he had made. And he gave thanks, deep wordless thanks that flowed from the center of his being, for the grace that had sustained him, for the wisdom that had been given to him, for the life that had been saved, for the lessons that continued to unfold. They crossed the pass as the sun reached its zenith, and the view that spread before them took Anselm's breath away. On the far side of the mountains, a valley opened up, green and lush, with a river winding through it like a silver ribbon. And there, nestled against the lower slopes, was Sankt Theodule, a cluster of stone buildings around a tall church spire. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, Anselm could hear the faint sound of bells ringing for the afternoon prayer. They descended as the afternoon shadows lengthened, and reached the monastery as Vespers was ending. The gates opened to receive them, and Abbot Gregor himself came out to welcome them, a tall man with a long beard going gray and eyes that crinkled with warmth and wisdom. He embraced Anselm like a long-lost brother and spoke words that made Anselm's heart swell. "Welcome, Brother Anselm. Welcome home." The monastery of Sankt Theodule was different from Sankt Gallen in many ways, yet fundamentally the same. The stones were different stones, quarried from different mountains. The chapel faced a different direction, its windows catching different angles of light. The brothers who lived here spoke with different accents, sang their chants with slightly different melodies, followed rhythms that were similar but not identical to those Anselm had known all his adult life. And yet, beneath these surface differences, the essence was the same. Men dedicated to God, living in community, seeking holiness through prayer and work and the discipline of the rule. Anselm and his two companions were given cells in the guest quarters, simple rooms that were clean and spare and welcoming. That first evening, they joined the brothers of Sankt Theodule for Compline, the final prayer of the day, and Anselm felt a deep peace settle over him as the familiar Latin words rose and fell in the candle-lit chapel. Whatever trials he had faced, whatever doubts had plagued him, he was still a monk, still part of this ancient tradition of men who had been praying these same prayers in communities like this one for more than 600 years. After the service, Abbot Gregor invited Anselm to his private chambers. The room was much like Father Dominic's, with a fire burning low in a stone hearth, shelves lined with books and scrolls, a crucifix hanging on the wall, a simple desk covered with parchments and letters. The abbot poured them each a small cup of wine, a luxury reserved for special occasions and honored guests, and they sat together in comfortable chairs. "Tell me everything," Abbot Gregor said simply. "Father Wilhelm's letter gave us the outline of what happened, but I want to hear it in your own words, with all the details, all the feelings, all the struggles. Take your time. We have all evening." And so Anselm told his story once more, but this time it was different. With Father Dominic, he had been a son confessing to a father, seeking absolution and understanding. With his brother monks at Sankt Gallen, he had been recounting an adventure, satisfying their curiosity. But with Abbot Gregor, he found himself engaged in something deeper, a kind of spiritual direction that probed not just the events but their meaning, not just what had happened but why it mattered. Abbot Gregor listened with complete attention, never interrupting, his eyes never leaving Anselm's face. When Anselm described hearing Matthias's call and the choice he had faced, the abbot leaned forward slightly. When Anselm spoke of the days in the cave and his fear that both he and Matthias would die, the abbot nodded slowly, as if recognizing something familiar. And when Anselm told of placing the reliquary on Matthias's chest and praying for Saint Columban's intercession, The abbot's eyes glistened with unshed tears. When Anselm finished, Abbot Gregor was silent for a long while, staring into the fire. Finally he spoke, his voice thoughtful and measured. "Brother Anselm, I want to tell you something about this reliquary that you carried with such care, that you guarded even in the midst of crisis and danger. The bone fragment it contains, said to be from St. Columban, was given to our monastery nearly 100 years ago by a traveling bishop who claimed to have received it from an abbey in Burgundy. We have no way to verify its authenticity. It may indeed be a fragment of the saint's bone, or it may be the bone of some other holy person, or it may simply be the bone of an anonymous Christian from centuries past. We do not know, and we never will know with certainty. But here is what I have come to understand in my years as abbot. The truth of a relic lies not primarily in its physical authenticity, but in its spiritual power to draw us closer to God, to remind us of those who have gone before us in faith, to connect us to the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us. Whether that bone fragment came from St. Columban's body or from another's, it served its sacred purpose when you held it and prayed over Matthias. Your faith, your compassion, your willingness to call upon the communion of saints for help, these things were real and powerful, regardless of the relic's provenance. And the same is true, in a way, of your entire journey. The items you were carrying, the manuscript, the oils, the reliquary, these were the ostensible purpose of your mission. But I am convinced now that God had a deeper purpose, one that included but transcended these material objects. You were meant to meet Matthias. You were meant to face the choice between duty and mercy. You were meant to learn lessons about love and sacrifice, and the true nature of obedience that would have been impossible to learn within the safe walls of a monastery. We monks can sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that holiness is primarily about withdrawal from the world, about separation and purity, and the perfection of our spiritual practices. And there is truth in this. We do need solitude and discipline and a certain apartness to grow in our relationship with God. But your experience reminds us that holiness is ultimately about love, about concrete acts of mercy and compassion, about laying down our lives for others. The contemplative life and the active life are not opposed but complementary, two expressions of the same fundamental calling to love God and neighbor. Your story has already begun to work on our community here. Since we received Father Wilhelm's letter, we have been discussing these themes in our chapter meetings, examining our own lives and practices, asking ourselves whether we have become too focused on rules and routines and not focused enough on the people around us who need our help. Several of our brothers have been inspired to reach out more to the local villagers, to offer teaching and assistance, to be present in the community in ways we had not been before. Your journey has borne fruit here before you even arrived. Anselm listened to these words with a sense of wonder. He had thought of his mission as a failure, a task left incomplete due to circumstances beyond his control. But Abbot Gregor was suggesting something different, that the mission had succeeded in ways deeper and more important than the simple delivery of goods, that the journey itself had been the point, that his struggles and choices had meaning far beyond what he had imagined. "Abbot Gregor," Anselm said slowly, "I am grateful for your wisdom and your understanding. But I must ask, do you still need the items I have brought? Are they still of use to you?" The abbot smiled. "Of course we do. The manuscript contains medical knowledge that will help us care for the sick. The blessed oils are needed for our sacraments. And the reliquary, authentic or not, will be a beautiful addition to our new chapel, a focus for prayer and devotion. These things have value, Brother Anselm. They are not worthless, but they are tools, means to an end, not ends in themselves. And that end is always love, always service, always the building up of God's kingdom in this world." They talked late into the night, these two monks separated by many miles, but united in their search for wisdom and truth. Abbot Gregor shared his own struggles and doubts, his own journey through years of monastic life, his own moments of choosing between competing goods. He spoke of the challenges of leadership, of trying to balance the needs of the community with the needs of individual brothers, of maintaining discipline while also showing mercy. And Anselm, in turn, found himself sharing things he had not spoken of before. His grief at losing his mother and sisters to fever when he was a boy, his struggle to find meaning in the endless copying of manuscripts, his moments of loneliness and doubt in the long nights of his cell. When they finally parted, well past midnight, Anselm felt as if he had found not just an understanding abbot but a true friend, a soul brother with whom he could be completely honest. As he lay in his narrow bed in the guest quarters, listening to the night sounds of this unfamiliar monastery, he reflected on how strange and wonderful God's ways were. He had set out months ago to deliver items to Saint Theodule, a simple administrative task. Instead, he had been given an experience that had transformed him, had saved a man's life, had touched communities in multiple places, and had brought him to this moment of deep spiritual friendship. Truly, as the scripture said, God's ways were not our ways, and his thoughts were higher than our thoughts. The next morning, after prayers and a simple breakfast, there was a formal ceremony in the chapel of Saint Theodule. All the brothers gathered, along with some laypeople from the surrounding area who had heard that the traveling monk had finally arrived. Anselm knelt before Abbot Gregor and with great solemnity presented the items he had carried through so much hardship. The manuscript, carefully wrapped and preserved despite everything. The blessed oils, their clay vessels unbroken, and the reliquary, its silver surface gleaming in the candlelight. Abbot Gregor received each item with prayers of thanksgiving, holding them up for all to see. Then he did something unexpected. He called Matthias's name, as if the woodcutter were present in the chapel, and he blessed him and his family, asking God to continue to protect and prosper them. He spoke of the choice Anselm had made, framing it not as a failure of duty, but as an example of the greatest commandment being lived out in action. And he invited all present to examine their own lives, to ask themselves whether they were truly living the law of love or merely following rules and regulations without heart. The ceremony concluded with the reliquary being placed in a specially prepared niche in the new chapel, a small alcove with a shelf of polished wood, and a candle that would be kept burning perpetually. Anselm knelt before it and prayed, thanking Saint Columban, or whoever's bones rested in that silver box, for interceding for Matthias, for watching over them both in the storm, for being a bridge between the earthly and the heavenly, the temporal and the eternal. Anselm remained at Sankt Theodule for 3 weeks, as Abbot Gregor had hoped he would. During that time, he met with the brothers individually and in groups, sharing his story and listening to theirs. He worked in their scriptorium, which was smaller than St. Gallen's, but had some rare manuscripts that he had never seen before. He walked in their gardens and helped with the spring planting. He joined them for all the offices, learning the particular customs and melodies that made this community unique. But perhaps most importantly, he spent long hours in conversation with Abbot Gregor, discussing theology and spirituality, the nature of monastic life, and the challenges facing the church in their age. They talked about how to balance the contemplative and active dimensions of religious life, how to maintain discipline without crushing the spirit, how to be faithful to tradition while remaining open to new insights. These conversations fed Anselm's mind and soul in ways he had not experienced since his early years of formation, when everything was new and every idea was exciting. One afternoon, as they walked together in the hills above the monastery, Abbot Gregor asked Anselm a question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Brother Anselm, if you could go back to that moment when you heard Matthias calling for help, knowing everything you know now, the storm that was coming, the days in the cave, the suffering you would endure, the mission you would fail to complete on time, would you make the same choice? Would you still stop to help him?" Anselm did not hesitate. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I would. Without doubt or question, I would make the same choice again." "Why?" Abbot Gregor pressed. "Why with such certainty?" Anselm thought for a moment, trying to put into words something he felt in his bones. "Because in that moment, I saw Christ in Matthias. I heard Christ calling for help through his voice. And how could I pass by Christ suffering, Christ in need, Christ calling out in the wilderness? All my years of prayer and study and devotion, all my vows and disciplines, what would they mean if I could walk past Christ himself without stopping?" The choice was not really a choice at all. It was the only thing I could do and still be who I am, who God has called me to be. Abbot Gregor stopped walking and turned to face Anselm, his hands on the younger monk's shoulders. "Brother Anselm, you have understood something that many never grasp in a lifetime of religious practice. You have understood that Christ is not only found in the tabernacle or in Scripture or in prayer, though he is surely there. He is also found in the suffering person, in the one who needs our help, in the stranger and the outcast and the forgotten. Whatever you did for the least of these my brothers, you did for me. This is the heart of the gospel, and you have lived it." On the day before Anselm was to depart Sankt Theodule to return home, Abbot Gregor gave him a gift. It was a small book, hand-copied by one of the brothers, containing selections from the Desert Fathers, those early Christian monks who had fled to the wilderness of Egypt and Syria to seek God in solitude and prayer. On the flyleaf in beautiful script, Abbot Gregor had written, "For Brother Anselm, who learned in a cave what the desert fathers learned in their cells, that God is found not in comfort and certainty, but in darkness and doubt, not in success, but in sacrifice, not in isolation, but in love. May you continue to grow in wisdom and grace all the days of your life. Your brother in Christ, Gregor, Abbot of St. Theodule." Anselm treasured this gift, holding the small book to his chest as tears flowed freely down his face. He had come to St. Theodule thinking of himself as a failed messenger, bearing items long overdue. He was leaving as a brother beloved, carrying wisdom and friendship that would sustain him for years to come. The journey back to St. Gallen took 4 days, for Anselm and his 2 companions traveled slowly, savoring the beautiful spring weather and stopping frequently to pray and to appreciate the world around them. They passed through Eisenberg again, and this time Anselm spent 2 full days there, staying with Matthias and his family, blessing the villagers, saying Mass in Father Wilhelm's church. The whole village turned out to see him, to touch his robe as if he were some kind of saint, though he protested that he was just an ordinary monk who had done what anyone would do. On the final evening in Eisenberg, there was a feast in the village square. Tables were set up and every family brought food to share. There was fresh bread and roasted meat, early spring vegetables, cheese and butter, and even some precious honey for sweetening. The children ran and played, while the adults ate and talked and laughed. Musicians brought out instruments, a fiddle, a flute, a drum, and there was dancing under the stars. Matthias stood, leaning on his cane, and called for silence. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "we are gathered tonight to honor Brother Anselm, who saved my life in the great blizzard this past winter. But I want to say something that maybe he doesn't realize. He didn't just save me. He saved my family, who would have been left without a husband and father. He saved this village, which would have lost one of its members and would have been diminished by that loss. He saved all of us in a way by reminding us what it means to be truly human, truly compassionate, truly willing to sacrifice for another." He paused, overcome with emotion, and Greta came to stand beside him, her hand on his arm. "Brother Anselm," Matthias continued, "you will always be part of our family, part of our village, part of our story. Your name will be spoken here for generations to come, and our children and our children's children will know what you did. We love you, brother, and we thank you." The villagers erupted in applause and cheers, and Anselm, embarrassed but deeply moved, could only bow his head and whisper his thanks. Later that night, when the feast was over and he was alone in the small room Father Wilhelm had given him, he reflected on Matthias's words. He had never thought of himself as saving anyone but Matthias. But now he saw the ripples spreading out from that one choice, touching lives he would never meet, shaping the future in ways he could not predict. It was both humbling and awe-inspiring to realize how much weight a single decision could carry, How much consequence could flow from one moment of choosing love over convenience, mercy over duty? When Anselm finally arrived back at St. Gallen, it was late afternoon on a warm day in early June. The apple trees in the orchard were heavy with small green fruit, and the gardens were lush with growing things. The monastery bells were ringing for vespers, and the sound washed over him like a benediction, welcoming him home. Father Dominic was waiting for him at the gate, and though the old abbot had grown even more frail in the weeks of Anselm's absence, his smile was bright and his embrace was strong. "Welcome home, my son," he said. "Welcome home. You have completed your mission, and you have brought honor to our community. Come, tell me everything." That evening, after prayers and supper, Anselm sat once more in Father Dominic's chambers and recounted his time at St. Theodule, his conversations with Abbot Gregor, his final visit to Eisenberg. Father Dominic listened with evident pleasure, nodding and smiling, occasionally asking questions. When Anselm showed him the book Abbot Gregor had given him and read aloud the inscription, the old abbot wiped tears from his eyes. "Brother Anselm," Father Dominic said, "when I sent you on this mission last December, I had no idea what God had in store for you, what He would teach you through trial and hardship. But now I see that it was all part of His plan, His way of shaping you into the monk, the man you are meant to become. You left here as a good copyist, a faithful brother, a reliable member of our community. You have returned as all these things, but also as something more, a man who has been tested and has not been found wanting, a man who knows in his bones what love requires, a man who has met Christ in the wilderness and has not turned away." He paused and then said something that shocked Anselm to his core. "Brother Anselm, I am old, and I will not live many more years. The time is coming when St. Gallen will need a new abbot, a new leader to guide this community into the future. I have been praying about who that might be, asking God to show me the brother who has the wisdom, the compassion, the strength to carry this responsibility. And now I believe I have my answer. I believe you are being prepared for this role, that your experiences this past year have been part of your formation as a future leader." Anselm was speechless. The thought of becoming abbot had never crossed his mind and had seemed utterly impossible. He was still young, relatively inexperienced, certainly not the most learned or the most holy of the brothers. But Father Dominic held up a hand to forestall his protests. "I am not saying this will happen tomorrow or next year. I am saying that I see in you the qualities that will be needed, and that you should begin to prepare yourself, to think about what it means to lead a community, to be responsible for the spiritual welfare of your brothers. Watch me. Learn from me, ask questions. And most of all, continue to grow in your relationship with God, for that is the foundation of all true leadership. A man who knows God, who loves God, who seeks God above all else, that man can lead others to do the same." In the months and years that followed, life at St. Gallen continued its ancient rhythms, but Anselm was changed. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, not just copying manuscripts, but also beginning to write his own texts, meditations on scripture, reflections on monastic life, explorations of the relationship between contemplation and action. His writings began to be noticed beyond the monastery, and other communities requested copies, spreading his ideas and insights more widely. He took on additional responsibilities, teaching younger monks, helping to manage the monastery's lands and resources, representing St. Gallen in meetings with other abbots and church officials. And he tried to embody, in his daily life and interactions, the lessons he had learned in that cave during the Great Blizzard, that people mattered more than policies, that love was the supreme rule, that mercy and duty were not opposed but two sides of the same coin. He maintained his connection with Matthias and his family, visiting Eisenberg once each year and welcoming them when they came to St. Gallen. He watched Jakob grow into a strong young man who eventually took over his father's work. He saw Maria marry a farmer from a neighboring village and start her own family. He held little hands, no longer so little, when the boy expressed interest in becoming a monk himself, and eventually helped guide his formation when he entered St. Gallen as a novice. And he corresponded regularly with Abbot Gregor, letters traveling back and forth between their monasteries, sharing news and ideas, continuing the deep spiritual friendship that had begun during those 3 weeks at St. Theodule. These letters became a treasured part of Anselm's life, a source of wisdom and encouragement, a reminder that he was part of a larger community that extended far beyond the walls of any single monastery. Father Dominic lived for 3 more years after Anselm's return from St. Theodule. They were good years, peaceful years, and the old abbot's joy was evident as he watched Anselm grow and mature in his vocation. On his deathbed, surrounded by his brothers, Father Dominic called Anselm to his side and spoke final words. "My son, my dear son, I have watched you become the man God meant you to be. Do not fear what lies ahead. Trust in God, serve your brothers with love, and remember always, people matter more than policies, souls matter more than schedules. Love is the only rule that finally matters. This is my blessing and my charge to you." Father Dominic died peacefully, and the monastery mourned him deeply. The process of electing a new abbot took several months, with much prayer and deliberation. When the votes were finally counted, Brother Anselm, now in his 35th year, was chosen to lead the community of St. Gallen. He accepted the responsibility with deep humility and not a little fear, kneeling in the chapel and asking God to grant him the wisdom and strength he would need. His years as abbot were marked by the same qualities he had demonstrated in that cave during the blizzard: compassion, wisdom, a willingness to put people before procedures, a deep trust in God's providence. Under his leadership, St. Gallen flourished, becoming known throughout the region not just for its scholarship and spiritual discipline, but for its service to the poor, its care for the sick, its welcome to travelers and pilgrims. The monastery's guest house was always full, and Abbot Anselm made it a point to dine with visitors, to hear their stories, to offer counsel and comfort. The years passed, as years do, marked by the eternal cycle of seasons and prayers, of harvests and holy days, of births and deaths in the villages surrounding the monastery. Abbot Anselm grew older, his dark hair slowly silvering, his face developing the lines and creases that come from years of both laughter and deep thought. But his eyes remained clear and kind, and those who came to him seeking guidance found in him a listener of rare quality, a man who truly heard not just their words but the yearnings of their hearts. The story of the frozen monk, as it came to be called, never faded from memory. It was told and retold throughout the region, embellished sometimes, but never losing its essential truth. A young monk had chosen mercy over duty, had saved a dying man at great personal cost, had learned in a storm-bound cave lessons about love that would shape the rest of his life. Parents told it to their children as a lesson in compassion. Priests used it in their homilies as an example of the gospel lived out in action. And in Eisenberg, it became part of the village's identity, a proud piece of their collective story. Matthias lived to a good old age, his leg always causing him some pain, but never preventing him from working and providing for his family. He and Greta had 2 more children after the blizzard, and they named one of them Anselm in honor of the monk who had saved their father. On his deathbed, surrounded by his large family, Matthias spoke of that time in the cave as the moment when he had understood what really mattered in life. "I was dying," he whispered, his voice weak but clear, "and Brother Anselm chose to die with me rather than leave me alone. That is love. That is what God is like. Remember that. Remember him." Young Hans, who had entered St. Gallen as a novice, eventually took his own vows and became Brother Johannes. He served the monastery faithfully for many years, and Abbot Anselm took special joy in watching the boy he had first met in that emotional reunion after the blizzard grow into a man of deep faith and commitment. Johannes eventually became the monastery's infirmarian, caring for sick and aging brothers with a tenderness that reflected the love his family had shown him growing up. Abbot Gregor of St. Theodule remained Anselm's closest friend and confidant until Gregor's death some 15 years after their first meeting. Their correspondence had grown to hundreds of letters, a remarkable record of 2 spiritual journeys intertwined, 2 minds grappling with the deepest questions of faith and life. When word came that Gregor had died peacefully in his sleep, Anselm wept openly in the chapter meeting, unashamed of his grief. "I have lost a brother," he told his monks, "a true brother of the soul. The world is diminished by his passing, but heaven is enriched." As Abbot Anselm grew older, he made it a practice to tell his story to each new novice who entered St. Gallen. He would take them aside, usually to walk in the orchard or sit by the river, and he would speak to them plainly about that winter journey, about the choice he had faced, about the lessons he had learned. He wanted them to understand from the beginning that monastic life was not about escaping from the world or from human need, but about learning to love more deeply, more truly, more sacrificially. "The rule is important," he would tell them. "Prayer is essential. Discipline and obedience have great value, But all of these things are means to an end, not ends in themselves. The end is always love. If your prayer does not make you more loving, if your discipline does not make you more compassionate, if your obedience does not make you more ready to serve others, then something has gone wrong. Never forget that. When in doubt, choose love. Choose mercy. Choose the person in need over the policy or procedure. You may sometimes be wrong in the details, but you will never be wrong in the direction. On the 40th anniversary of the Great Blizzard, when Anselm was an old man himself, the communities of Sankt Gallen and Sankt Theodule organized a special commemoration. Monks from both monasteries met at Eisenberg, where Father Wilhelm's successor as village priest hosted them. The entire village turned out, including 3 generations of Matthias's family. Maria, now a grandmother herself, presented Abbot Anselm with a beautiful wooden carving she had made, a scene of a cave with 2 figures huddled by a fire, surrounded by swirling snow. It was exquisite work, the product of a lifetime of developing the talent she had shown as a child. There was a special mass said in the village church, and afterward, Abbot Anselm stood before the gathered crowd and spoke. His voice was still strong despite his years, and his words carried across the assembly. My dear friends, my brothers and sisters in Christ, we gather today to remember events that took place 40 years ago, when I was a young monk and Matthias was a young father, when a storm greater than any in living memory swept across these mountains and changed all our lives. But I want to tell you something that perhaps you have not fully understood. What happened in that cave was not about me being a hero. It was about God's grace, working through a terrified, confused young monk who simply tried to do the right thing in an impossible situation. I have lived with the memory of those days for 4 decades now, and the older I get, the more clearly I see the hand of providence in it all. Every choice I made, every moment of doubt and fear, every prayer I uttered in desperation, all of it was part of a larger pattern, a tapestry being woven by God that I could not see at the time. I thought I was failing in my mission. God knew I was succeeding in a deeper mission I had not even known existed. Matthias lived because God sent me to find him, yes. But I lived, truly lived in the deepest sense, because God sent Matthias to teach me what love requires. We saved each other in that cave. We taught each other what it means to be human, to be brothers, to be part of the great family of God. And so today, as we remember, I want to thank all of you. Thank you, people of Eisenberg, for welcoming a half-frozen monk and his injured companion with such generosity. Thank you for the years of friendship that have followed. Thank you, Matthias's family, for sharing your husband and father and grandfather with me, for allowing me to be part of your story. Thank you, my brother monks, for bearing with an abbot who has sometimes chosen mercy over rules, and who has probably driven you crazy with his insistence that love matters more than procedures. Most of all, I want to thank God, who teaches us through storms and through stillness, through success and through failure, through the planned and through the unexpected, who meets us in caves and in chapels, in scripture and in human faces, in the familiar and in the strange, who never stops calling us to become more than we think we can be, to love more than we think we can love, to give more than we think we can give. That is what I learned in the winter of 1142, and that is what I am still learning today. And that, my friends, is what I hope you will remember long after I am gone. That God is always with us, always working, always loving, always calling us to choose mercy over fear, compassion over convenience, love over everything else. This is the way, this is the truth. This is life. The crowd was silent when he finished, many wiping tears from their eyes. Then someone began to sing, a simple hymn that everyone knew, and soon the whole assembly joined in, their voices rising together in praise and thanksgiving, celebrating not just the memory of a long-ago storm, but the enduring truth that love is stronger than death, that mercy triumphs over judgment, that God's ways are past finding out but always good, always leading us home. Abbot Anselm lived for 3 more years after that commemoration. They were peaceful years, during which he gradually handed over more and more of his duties to younger brothers, preparing the community for the transition that would come with his death. He spent his final years much as he had spent his first years in the monastery, in prayer, in study, in the quiet copying of manuscripts. But now there was a depth to his prayer, a wisdom in his study, a beauty in his handwriting that came from a lifetime of seeking God and finding him in unexpected places. On a cold December morning, almost exactly 43 years after he had set out on that fateful journey to St. Theodule, Abbot Anselm died peacefully in his sleep. The bells of St. Gallen rang out the news, and soon the word spread throughout the region. He was mourned deeply and widely by his brother monks, by the villagers of Eisenberg and countless other communities he had touched, by other monasteries whose abbots had learned from his wisdom, by the poor and sick he had served, by travelers he had welcomed, by novices he had formed. At his funeral, representatives came from St. Theodule and from Eisenberg and from dozens of other places. Brother Johannes, the boy who had been Little Hans, delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of the man. Abbot Anselm taught us that holiness is not about being perfect or untouched by struggle. It is about choosing love when love is difficult, about showing mercy when justice might seem easier, about staying with those in need even when it costs us everything. He learned this in a cave during a blizzard, and he never forgot it. And because he never forgot it, none of us will either. The wooden carving Maria had made, showing the cave and the 2 figures by the fire, was placed in the monastery chapel in a position of honor. It remained there for centuries, a reminder to generations of monks yet to come of that winter when a young brother had faced an impossible choice and had chosen love. Pilgrims would come to see it, to hear the story, to be inspired by this example of mercy lived out in action. And on winter nights, when the wind howled around the stone walls of St. Gallen and snow fell thick and fast, the older monks would gather the younger ones by the fire and tell them the story of the frozen monk. They would speak of Brother Anselm, who had once been young and uncertain like them, who had faced his moment of testing and had not been found wanting, who had learned in darkness and cold and fear that love is the only thing that finally matters, the only thing that endures, the only thing that can light our way through the longest night. The story would end, as it always did, with the same words Abbot Anselm had spoken so many times. When in doubt, choose love. Choose mercy. Choose the person in need. You may sometimes be wrong in the details, but you will never be wrong in the direction. And the young monks would nod, absorbing this wisdom, carrying it forward into their own lives and their own moments of testing, keeping alive the memory of one winter's night when a monk and a woodcutter had saved each other in a cave, when duty and mercy had met and become one, when the blizzard of 1142 had taught lessons that would echo through the centuries. Rest well, dear friend. May your dreams be as peaceful as fresh snow falling on a silent forest, as gentle as the dawn light touching mountain peaks, as warm as a fire in a cave shared between brothers. Sleep now and know that love endures, mercy triumphs, and grace is always sufficient for whatever storms may come. Good night.